I stood in a room full of government ministers and Islamic scholars and told them that Jesus Christ was a myth. I had my evidence. I had my argument. I had 20 years of training behind every sentence. That same night, he walked into my dream and called me by name. 6 months later, I would lose my father, my family's trust, the career I had spent a decade building, and the identity I had constructed since I was 5 years old. And I would tell you that what I found was worth every single thing I lost. But we are not there yet. My name is Layla Hadid. I'm 34 years old. I was born in the United Arab Emirates. My father, Tariq Hadid, was a senior policy advisor to the government. My mother came from a family of Islamic scholars going back generations. I was not simply a Muslim. I was the daughter of people for whom Islam was not just faith, but bloodline, vocation, and identity compressed into one thing. I was expected to carry that forward. I did. For a very long time, I carried it with everything I had. My earliest memory of my father is sitting on his knee in the main room of our villa when I was 5 years old. I need to tell you who Tariq Hadid was before I tell you what I did to him, because this story is not only about what I found, it is about what I lost, and you cannot feel the weight of the loss if you do not know the man. He was not the kind of father who gave speeches. He was the kind who showed up. He was at every school event I ever attended, every debate competition, every Islamic knowledge contest, every graduation. He sat in the front row, and afterward he found me in the crowd and said, "That was excellent. Now tell me what you would do differently next time." He was demanding in the way that only people who love you completely can be demanding, because he believed I was capable of more than I had yet done, and he wanted to see it. He prayed every prayer on time every day without exception. He woke before the call to prayer and prostrated in the dark while the rest of the house slept. I know this because I was sometimes awake in those early hours, and I could hear him through the wall. Not the words, the rhythm, the particular cadence of a man in complete conversation with God. It was the most consistent sound of my childhood. He believed, with a certainty that was not performance but actual bone-deep conviction, that everything we had, our position, our safety, our future, came directly from obedience to God. He was not a man who talked about his blessings to impress people. He talked about them as evidence, as the proof that the formula worked, his formula, and mine, and the whole architecture of our family's life was this: hold the rope. Do not let go. That morning when I was 5, he sat me on his knee and said, "Layla, Allah has blessed this family beyond what most people will ever see. Not because we are special, because we have never compromised on the truth. We hold the rope. We do not let go. Promise me you will not let go." I promised him. I meant every syllable. What I did not know was that 29 years later I would sit across from him in that same room and watch him weep, and I would be the reason. But we are not there yet. My mother Amira memorized large portions of the Quran. She taught all 4 of us children at the kitchen table every morning before school. She read and explained. She did not make it feel like a task. She made it feel like the most important thing happening in the world, which she genuinely believed it was. I was the eldest. I understood early what that meant. By 14, I had memorized the entire Quran. My Islamic studies teacher told my father I had a scholar's mind, and it would be wrong not to develop it. He arranged private study with a woman named Sheikha Huda, who had trained in Medina and Cairo, and had written books on Islamic jurisprudence. Twice a week I sat in her study surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and learned to think theologically. She taught me Islamic history, the biography of the Prophet, the principles of Islamic law, the philosophy of God's existence, and she taught me apologetics, how to prove Islam was true and everything else was not. We studied the alleged corruptions of the Bible, the Council of Nicaea, and the claim that Christians had altered the original gospel. The argument that Jesus never claimed to be God, that the Trinity was a pagan concept, that Paul had hijacked a Jewish prophet and turned him into something his original followers would not have recognized. I absorbed all of it. I was fast. I had a sharp tongue and I enjoyed using it. By 17, I could dismantle a Christian argument in 2 minutes. I had done it at school debates, at family gatherings, in online forums. Winning those arguments felt like scoring a goal in a match that actually mattered. It confirmed what I already knew. Islam was undefeatable because it was true. I was its defender. I left the Emirates at 18 to study political science at Northwestern University outside Chicago. Northwestern was my father's choice. He had colleagues who knew the school, knew the Muslim Students Association on campus, had arranged for me to be connected with the Muslim chaplain before I arrived. He wanted me educated in the American system, sharpened by it, but anchored in what we were. Chicago in November was a physical shock after my entire life in the Gulf. The cold was not weather. It was a presence. The wind off Lake Michigan did not go around you. It went through you. I stood on the corner of Sheridan Road my first week, and genuinely could not believe that people chose to live here voluntarily. I called my father from that corner and told him I had arrived and the weather was trying to kill me, and he laughed in the way he only laughed when he was genuinely happy, from the chest, and said, "Hold the rope, Layla. The rope is warm even when the weather is not." That was the last purely good phone call for a long time. The cold was not the real shock. The real shock was freedom. Not freedom to do wrong things. I was not interested in that. Freedom to be anonymous. There was no extended family on this campus. There was no neighborhood where my father's name arrived before I did. There was no invisible network of social accountability watching what I wore and who I spoke to and which prayer I might have missed. Nobody was watching. I had never in my life been in a place where nobody was watching. I held firm. I prayed in my dorm room facing east-southeast toward Mecca and calculated the prayer times manually because the app gave slightly different numbers than I trusted. I fasted all of Ramadan alone in a city that did not know it was Ramadan. My roommate, a pre-law student from San Diego named Jennifer, watched me not eat for a month with the polite bewilderment of someone who has never encountered this before and does not want to be rude. I attended the MSA every Friday. I called my father every night. I did everything I had always done. But I was doing it in a place where no one required it of me, and that distinction turned out to matter more than I expected. You cannot spend 4 years at Northwestern without making friends outside any single circle. It is simply not possible. I had a study partner named Rachel, from a small town in Georgia, the daughter of a Baptist pastor. Rachel was the most genuinely kind person I had encountered outside my immediate family. She made terrible jokes. She brought homemade peach cobbler to study sessions in the library. She remembered the names of everyone she had ever met, and asked about them months later in a way that made you feel like you had been held in her mind the whole time. She never pushed her faith on me. Not once in 4 years. She just lived her life with a quiet, steady warmth that I noticed even when I was not trying to. One night during our second year, we were both destroyed from exams, and we ended up eating takeout on the steps outside the library at midnight and talking about things that were not political theory. She asked me what I believed happened after death. I told her the Islamic view. She listened. Then she asked if she could share what she believed. I said yes, mostly out of politeness. She talked about grace. She said she believed no human being could earn their way to God because no human being was good enough. She said she believed Jesus had paid the full debt, permanently, completely, and that what he offered was not a reward for performance, but a gift received by faith. She said it the way she said everything. Simply. No drama. Like she was describing something that had been obvious to her for years. I waited for her to finish. Then I delivered my 2-minute dismantling. Nisaiah. Paul's corruption of the original message, the Trinity's pagan roots, the absence of any verse where Jesus explicitly says, "I am God, worship me." I was thorough. I ended where I always ended. I said, Islam gives you a God who is perfectly just and perfectly consistent. Christianity gives you a God who changes the rules. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I hear you. I'm not going to argue with any of that. I've just experienced something in Jesus that I can't explain away with history. I filed that away and moved on. I graduated with honors, returned to the Emirates, built a career in policy consulting that used my American degree and my family's connections in the Gulf. Within 3 years, I had a small firm advising international organizations on compliance and regional affairs. I started writing for publications about professional Muslim women navigating the Western world without compromising their faith. I gave talks in Dubai, Riyadh, Kuala Lumpur. I was quoted as a voice of confident, modern, unapologetic Islam. I loved it. I loved being the proof. The proof that you could hold the rope and still succeed by any measure the Western world used. Then came the conference in Abu Dhabi. It was organized by a government cultural foundation, and it brought together religious thinkers from around the world for a conversation about coexistence. Christian pastors from the United States, Jewish rabbis, Buddhist scholars. My father was in the audience. Several government officials were in the audience. It was the biggest stage I had ever stood on. I gave a presentation called The Completeness of Islam in a Plural World. 45 minutes of everything Sheikha Huda had taught me, sharpened by a decade of my own study. I argued that Islam was not one truth among equal truths. It was the final truth, the corrected, perfected version of every revelation before it. Including the Gospel of Jesus, which I described as originally authentic, but so thoroughly altered by human hands that what modern Christians followed bore little resemblance to what Jesus actually taught. I looked directly at the Christian delegation when I said that. When I finished, my father stood before the applause started. Afterward, at the reception, a tall American pastor from Atlanta named Dr. James Whitfield came up to me. He was about 60, with the calm face and direct eyes of someone who had spent decades in difficult conversations without losing their composure. He shook my hand and said that was a remarkable presentation. He asked if he could ask me a genuine question, not a debate question, a real one. I said yes. He said, "Have you ever asked Jesus himself whether he's who he says he is? Not through secondary sources, not in an argument, directly, personally, as a prayer." I almost laughed. I said, "With respect, Pastor, that question assumes he is someone who can be asked." He nodded. He said, "I understand. I just want to offer you one thought. You've studied about Jesus your entire life. I wonder if you've ever actually talked to him." I moved on to greet other guests. But his words attached themselves to me the way certain things do, not because they were convincing, because they were annoying. And things that annoy you, I have learned, are usually things that got too close to something real. Now leave a comment with the word dream. Just that word. Because what happened that night is why this story exists. That evening in my apartment, I sat on the living room floor in my pajamas eating leftover rice and feeling nothing in particular. Not sad, not worried. Empty in the specific way that follows a performance. The curtain comes down and the lights come up and you are suddenly just a person. Not a speaker, not a scholar, not a defender. Just a woman eating cold rice at 11 at night, alone. I went to bed without praying. That was unusual for me. I just lay down and stared at the ceiling. That is when the dream began. I want to be careful here. People always want me to make this more dramatic, to add details I did not experience. I will not do that. I will tell you exactly what happened. Nothing more. In the dream, I was in my grandmother's apartment in Abu Dhabi. The original one. Not the one my family moved to after she died. The one with the low ceilings and the smell of rose water and the ceiling fan that rattled slightly in her sitting room. I was a child, 8 or 9 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor the way I used to sit there as a girl. A man was in the room. He had not walked in. He was just there. the way things happen in dreams. He was standing near the window. He wore something white. I cannot describe his face in detail except to say it was the kindest face I had ever seen. And looking at it made me feel simultaneously very small and completely safe, like being a child in the presence of someone who could carry everything you could not. He looked at me and said my name. Not Layla Hadid. Not Dr. Hadid. Not sister or professor. Just Layla. 2 syllables, the way my mother said it when I was small and had done nothing yet to earn anything. Before the debates, before the Quran memorized, before the conference stages. He said it like he had been saying it for years. I said, "Who are you?" He said, "You already know who I am." I woke up at 3 in the morning. My room was dark and cool and completely ordinary. I sat up against the headboard and pressed my knees to my chest. My heart was not racing. There was no fear. There was something I could not name. A stillness like the air after a very loud sound. I said out loud to the empty room, "That was just a dream." It meant nothing. I said it the way you say something when you need to convince yourself, not when you are already convinced. I did not sleep again that night. 3 days later, I called my closest friend, Dina. We had been friends since university. She was Egyptian, living in Boston with her husband and 2 young children, and she was the person I called when I needed to think out loud. I told her I had a strange dream about a religious figure, and it had unsettled me. She went very still on the phone. She said, "Was it a man in white who knew your name?" I said, "Why would you ask that?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said carefully, "Because 2 years ago I had the same dream, and it changed everything for me." What Dina told me took 40 minutes. I sat on my kitchen floor after she hung up and stared at the wall. Dina, my devout Egyptian friend who sent me Quran verses every morning and had performed Hajj and discussed Islamic parenting with total confidence, had been quietly following Jesus for 18 months. She said after her dream, she began searching. She found an online community of Arab women who had converted from Islam to Christianity. She started reading the New Testament in Arabic. She said the Jesus she found in the Gospels was nothing like the figure she had been taught to dismiss. He was real, specific, alive in a way that nothing in her Islamic devotion had ever felt. She said she still had not told her husband. She asked me, "Do you want to know who was in your dream?" I said, "I already know who people are going to say it was." She said, "That is not what I asked." I hung up, not because I was angry, because I needed to be alone with what was happening inside me. Something had cracked. The crack was the problem. Not broken open. Cracked. Small, almost invisible. But a crack in something I had been maintaining for 30 years is not a small thing. I turned it into an investigation. That was how I coped. I was a policy analyst. I handled everything by building cases. I told myself, if I investigate Christianity properly, with the same rigor I bring to anything else, I will find the same flaws I have always found. I will come out the other side intact, and this crack will seal. I had 3 arguments. They were my foundation. I had built my entire public career on them. I had delivered them in front of government ministers, in front of scholars, in front of an international interfaith conference with my father in the audience. I was about to dismantle them myself. The first argument, the Gospels are corrupted. The biblical manuscripts were altered by human hands over centuries. What modern Christians follow bears no resemblance to what Jesus originally taught. I had used this argument at the Abu Dhabi conference. I had used it on Rachel at the library in Chicago. I had used it in online forums, at family gatherings, in published articles. I had never actually read what the other side said about it, not the primary scholarship. I had read Muslim responses to Christian scholars. I had never read the Christian scholars themselves. I sat at my desk at 1 a.m. and opened the actual textual scholarship for the first time. What I found was not what I had been taught. The manuscript evidence for the New Testament was not weak. It was, by the standard I would apply to any ancient document, extraordinarily strong. Earlier, more numerous, and more internally consistent than almost any other text from the ancient world that I had never questioned. The Iliad, Caesar's Gallic Wars, Plato's dialogues. I had never doubted those texts. The standard I applied to them, applied consistently to the New Testament, did not produce a corrupted document. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. I had delivered this argument confidently for 15 years. It had felt like standing on concrete. The concrete was not there. That was the first night I did not sleep until almost 4. The second argument, Jesus never claimed to be God. The divine claim was invented by Paul and formalized at Nicaea. I went to the text directly. Not Islamic responses to Christian scholars, the Gospels themselves. Before Abraham was, I am. I and the Father are one. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. These predated Nicaea by centuries. Then in Mark chapter 2, the earliest gospel we have, Jesus forgives a man's sins, and when the religious scholars ask who can forgive sins but God alone, he does not correct them. He demonstrates his authority instead. I had told people for 15 years that the divine claim was a late invention. It was in the first gospel written down. Second foundation gone. And I was tired in a way I had not anticipated. The third fell fastest. The resurrection is a legend. Grief produces visions. Desperate people construct meaning. But Paul's letter to the Corinthians, dated by mainstream historians to within 25 years of the crucifixion, lists named eyewitnesses still alive when he wrote it. He was saying, you can check this. These people are here. And James, the brother of Jesus, who had every reason not to believe, was executed for refusing to recant his claim that he had seen his brother alive. People do not die for things they know are false. 3 arguments. 3 losses. I want to be honest about what this felt like, because if I smooth it over, the story becomes a clean conversion narrative, and that would not be true. This did not feel like relief. It felt like standing in a room where the walls I had built my entire adult life were coming down, one by one, and I had no idea what would be standing when they were all gone. I was not finding faith. I was losing the case I had spent 20 years constructing, and I could not stop looking. I want to be honest about what happened during those weeks, because this is the part of the story where I could perform a clean conversion narrative, and that would not be true. The truth is messier. I was fighting. Every night after my client work was done, I sat at my desk with tea going cold beside my laptop, and I looked for the argument I had not examined yet. I found responses. I found counter-arguments to the counter-arguments. I found scholars on both sides. And what I found, applying the same standard I brought to my professional work, was that the intellectual case against Christianity was significantly weaker than I had been taught, and the intellectual case for the resurrection was significantly stronger than I had been willing to see. This did not produce faith. It produced a problem. I did not know what to do with a problem I could not argue my way out of. Then Rachel texted me. Out of nowhere. 4 years since we had spoken. She had seen a post I had shared from the Abu Dhabi conference. She said, Layla, I have been praying for you since Northwestern. I am not going to say anything else except that if you ever want to talk, I am here. I called her from my apartment in the Emirates at 2 a.m, her time in Atlanta. She answered. She did not mention the hour. I told her everything. The dream, Dina's phone call, the 6 weeks, the arguments I had built my career on collapsing one by one when I actually looked. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, What do you want right now? Not what are the implications. Not what will your father say. What do you actually want? I said, I want to know if he is real. She said, Then ask him. the same way you would ask a person. Not a ritual, not a formula, just honestly. He can handle honest. I said I had been doing something like that for 6 weeks. She said, keep going. We stayed on the phone for another 2 hours. She did not lecture me. She did not press. She just talked about the Gospels the way she talked about everything, like they were accounts of a real person who had walked on the actual earth. She got to John chapter 4. The woman at the well. I had read this passage during my 6 weeks of investigation. But hearing Rachel tell it out loud, slowly, like a story, not an argument, was different. A woman who had been married 5 times, now living with a man she was not married to, came to draw water alone at noon because she did not want to be seen. Jesus was sitting at the well. He was Jewish. She was Samaritan. The social rules of his time meant a rabbi did not speak alone to a woman in public. He spoke to her first. He already knew everything about her before she said a word, and he was not there to correct her or condemn her or give her a list of what she needed to fix. He was there specifically for her. He had gone out of his way. I had done everything right my whole life. Memorized the Quran by 14. Prayed every prayer. Won every argument. Held the rope. And I was the most empty I had ever been. This woman had done everything wrong by every standard available, and he crossed every social and religious line to sit at that well and wait for her. I put the phone down. Not because Rachel had stopped talking, because I did not need her to continue. Something had shifted in the room. Not a voice, not a light, just a presence. The specific sense of not being alone that I had not felt in prayer for longer than I could remember. The room was ordinary. My kitchen floor in the Emirates at 2 a.m, cold tile, phone on the counter, tea gone cold. And yet I was not alone in it. The crack had become an opening. I had spent 6 weeks trying to solve a problem. 6 weeks looking for the argument that would let me rebuild the walls that were coming down around me. But sitting there on that kitchen floor, I realized something. I was no longer trying to prove Christianity wrong. I was trying to avoid the possibility that it might be true. Somewhere in those 2 hours with Rachel, I stopped fighting. Not because I had found the perfect argument, because I had finally become willing to follow the evidence wherever it led. I said to Rachel, "I think I need to do this." She said, "I know. I have known for a while." I said, "I do not know the words." She said, "There are no required words. Just be honest with him. He already knows." I put the phone down on the counter, and I sat there on the kitchen floor in the Emirates at 2 a.m, and I said out loud to the empty room, "I believe you are real. I believe you are who you say you are. I do not understand all of it yet. But I believe. Help me understand the rest." That was all. What happened after those words was more real than anything I had experienced in 34 years of flawless religious performance. A warmth that started in my chest and spread outward. Not physical, or not only physical. The closest I can come to describing it is this. Have you ever been in a room alone and felt completely alone, and then heard a key in the lock and known that the person you most needed was about to walk in? That specific shift from alone to not alone. That specific change in the quality of the air. That is what I felt, except no one walked in, and I understood that whoever it was had already been there the whole time. I sat on that floor for a long time. Then I cried. Not the dramatic tears of the testimonies I had always dismissed. Steady and quiet, running down my face while I sat on the kitchen tile in the dark. For the first time in my adult life, the first time I could remember, I was not performing anything for anyone. Not for my father. Not for any audience, real or imagined. Just resting. 34 years of performing perfect faith, and the real thing felt nothing like the performance. It felt like putting down something very heavy that I had been carrying so long I had stopped noticing the weight. Going public was not a single decision. It was a series of pressures that built over 9 months until I could not hold the shape of the secret anymore. For 9 months after the kitchen floor, I lived a double life. I found an online community of Arab Christian women, many of them converts, who met weekly by video and prayed and studied together. Some were in the Gulf. Some were in Europe and North America. Some were in places where discovery meant real physical danger. They became my church, the place where I did not have to perform or defend or argue, the place where I could just be Layla, new and uncertain and learning. I also found a church in the expat district, legal, licensed for expatriate congregations. I drove myself on Friday mornings and parked 3 streets away and wore sunglasses and dressed in a way that would not draw attention. A small congregation, plastic chairs, a worship band that played with the kind of joy that made your chest hurt. The pastor, a Filipino man named Samuel, shook my hand the first Sunday and said, "Welcome home, sister." That was all. No interrogation. No checklist of what I needed to prove. I sat in the back row and sang words I did not know yet and cried behind my sunglasses. Then my father called. He had heard about a conference being organized in Dubai by an American Christian ministry that was targeting Muslims with evangelism material. He wanted me to attend as the Muslim intellectual countervoice. He said, "Layla, you are the best person I know for this. You have spent your whole life preparing for exactly this moment." I sat with the phone in my hand and felt the ground move. I said, "Baba, I need to tell you something." He said, "What?" I could not do it on the phone. I said nothing. I will think about the conference. 3 weeks of what I can only describe as a war inside my chest. Everything I had built on one side. On the other side, a quiet certainty that I belonged to Jesus now and could not go stand at a conference and argue against him with the same mouth I used to worship him. I called Rachel. I prayed. And then I did something I had never done in my professional life. I called my father and told him I could not attend. I said I had changed my position on some things and needed time. My father went quiet. He knew me since I was 5 years old. He did not press. But the way he said goodbye told me he already suspected something had shifted. 3 weeks later, I drove to his villa. We sat in the same sitting room where he had told me to hold the rope when I was a child. I asked the household staff to leave us. I looked at my father, and I told him I had become a follower of Jesus Christ. What happened in that room in the next hour I will not describe fully, because some of it belongs only to my father and me. What I will tell you is this. My father wept. This man I had never seen cry in 34 years. He wept from a grief that was genuine and deep, and broke my heart even as I sat firm in what I knew. He said I had been deceived. He said I had dishonored everything he had built. He said I had betrayed my lineage and my God. He said it with the specific pain of a man who had poured his life into a child and watched that child walk away from everything he had given her. I let him say all of it. When he ran out of words, I said, "Baba, I love you. I am not doing this to hurt you. I am doing this because I met someone real and I cannot pretend I did not. I hope one day you will understand." He asked me to leave his house. I sat in my car in the parking area outside his villa for 45 minutes, hands shaking, face wet. The rest of what was coming already in motion. My mother called the next morning. I knew it was her before I answered. She called every day. She had called every day since I left home at 18. We talked about everything. Work, family, what she had cooked, what my brothers were doing, what Sarah had said to make her laugh. 16 years of daily calls. When I picked up, she said my name. Just my name. And I knew from the way she said it that my father had told her. Her voice was cold in a way I had never heard from her in my entire life. Not angry. Cold. There is a difference. Anger is hot, and it passes. Cold is a decision. She said, You have killed something in this family. Do you understand that? This is something that cannot be fixed. I said, Mama. She said, Do not call me that right now. She hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. My brothers did not call. They did not text. They simply stopped. The group family chat, which had run continuously since 2014, went quiet. Not because anyone announced they were leaving, because they stopped responding to anything I sent. After 2 weeks, I stopped sending. Then came Sarah's message. Sarah is 3 years younger than me. When we were children, she followed me everywhere. When I went to Northwestern, she cried at the airport. Not the quiet crying of someone trying to hold it together. The full crying of someone who had not decided to be dignified about it yet. We talked every day for the 16 years I was away. Not most days. Every day. When her son was born, I was on the phone with her through most of the labor because her husband was stuck in traffic, and she did not want to wait alone. One message. No phone call. Just text. I don't know who you are anymore. Then nothing. I read that message probably 40 times over the following week. Not because I thought the meaning would change, because I kept hoping I had misread something. Some tone I had missed. Some door left slightly open. There was no door. There was a woman I had known my whole life, who had my same parents, and my same childhood, and my same grandmother's apartment with the rose water smell, and the rattling ceiling fan. And she had looked at what I had done and said, I do not recognize you. I want to stay here. Because testimonies always rush past the losses to get to the triumph, and I refuse to do that. The triumph is real. But the cost was real first. 2 of my largest clients terminated their contracts within a month. Neither of them said why. They did not need to. The Gulf consulting world runs entirely on personal trust and family connection. My family had made clear, in the quiet way these things are made clear, that my name was no longer attached to theirs. Without that attachment, I was a consultant, with no floor, and no ceiling, and no walls. My mother's cold voice stayed with me longer than any of her words. I had heard every register of that voice my whole life. Proud, worried, tired, laughing, firm. I had never heard it cold. It is the voice that read Quran to me at the kitchen table every morning before school. It is the voice that said my name in the hospital when I was born. And it called me to say I had killed something in the family that could not be fixed. I prayed for them, every day, not for them to convert. I was not going to bargain with God about that. I prayed that they would know they were loved, that whatever was true would find them the way it had found me, through the specific door that only they could open. I need to tell you what the 6 weeks before that moment looked like, because the analysis I hear about conversion stories is that the hard part is the conversion itself, the decision, the kitchen floor. And yes, that was hard. But the 6 weeks after telling my father were harder in a different way, because the kitchen floor was between me and God was present. The 6 weeks after were between me and everyone else, and there was no warmth in that. I had no clients. I had no family contact. I had my small community of Arab Christian women on the video calls, and I had Rachel 2 time zones away, and I had the Bible I kept inside a plain cover on my office shelf between the legal textbooks. I also had a growing sense that I could not keep living inside this secret. I had been a public voice for Islam. I had written articles. I had given conference presentations. There were people who had heard me argue against Christianity, convincingly in public on stages, who did not know that the woman who made those arguments no longer believed them. There was something wrong about that, something that was not compatible with the person I was becoming. But the fear was real. I sat with the blank recording screen for 3 nights before I could press record. 3 nights of opening the laptop, sitting in the chair, looking at the small green light that meant the camera was ready, and then closing the laptop and walking to the kitchen and making tea I did not drink. I called Rachel on the 3rd night. I said, I do not know if I can do this. I do not know what happens to me after this. She said, What is the worst thing that could happen? I listed it. No career. No family, no safety net, public backlash, legal exposure, everything I had spent a decade building, gone. She was quiet. Then she said, "And the best thing?" I thought about Hannah, the woman from Toronto who had written me privately after finding my profile online. She had seen a comment I had left somewhere, tracked it back to me. She said she had the crack. She had had it for years. She did not know what to do with it. I thought about every woman who had ever sat in a room listening to me argue that Jesus was a myth and gone home with her crack a little wider and no one to tell. I pressed record. 6 weeks after telling my father, I sat down in front of my laptop camera in a plain room with a bookshelf behind me and recorded a video. I told my story from the beginning. The daughter of a government advisor. The Quran memorized by 14. The debates and the conference stages and the interfaith event where I stood in front of scholars and princes and told them Jesus was a myth. The American pastor asking if I had ever actually talked to him. The dream. The crack. The 6 weeks. The 3 arguments I had built my career on collapsing when I actually looked at the evidence. The kitchen floor. I looked into the camera and I said, I spent my whole life telling people that Jesus was a corrupted prophet whose story had been changed by men with agendas. I said it in front of scholars and ministers, and I believed every word of it. And then he showed up in a dream and said my name, and I have not been the same since. Not because of the dream by itself, because when I actually looked, when I investigated with the same rigor I gave everything else, I found that the arguments I had been delivering for 20 years were weaker than I had been told, and the person I had been arguing against was more real and more present than I had ever imagined. I said, the emptiness I carried as the most perfect Muslim woman in every room I walked into was real. The fullness I found on a kitchen floor in Abu Dhabi talking to Jesus was also real. I cannot give you proof you can hold in your hand. But I can tell you that the woman recording this video is more at peace than she has ever been. And if that peace cost me my father's house and my family's embrace and my career, I want you to understand what it must be worth. I posted the video. Within 48 hours, 200,000 people had watched it. Within a week, 3 million. Messages came in too fast to read. Saudi women who had never told anyone about their doubts. Men in the Gulf, writing from anonymous accounts, saying they had been hiding the same question for years. A young woman in Amman who said she had been planning to end her life and watched the video by accident and decided to give Jesus one conversation first. A grandmother in Morocco who said she had been secretly praying to Jesus since her own dream 30 years ago and had never met another Muslim woman who understood. And a message from a 28-year-old woman named Hannah, born in Lebanon, raised in Canada, who said she had grown up with the exact combination of perfect Islamic performance and complete internal emptiness that I had described. She said when I described the crack, she started crying because she had had that crack for years and never had a word for it. She asked me what to say when she prayed to Jesus. I wrote back, just say exactly what you feel. Tell him you want to know if he is real, that you are tired and you are looking and you need him to show you. That is enough. He can work with honest. She wrote back 4 days later. She said she had not slept in 3 days because she kept reading the Gospel of John. She said something had happened when she prayed that she could not explain, but she knew was real. I sat at my desk and thanked Jesus out loud. My father has not spoken to me in 8 months. I pray for him every day. I do not pray for him to convert. I pray that he will know the love of God as personally and undeniably as I know it. In whatever form reaches him, in whatever language he can receive. I am no longer the woman who stood in front of ministers and scholars with airtight arguments about the corruption of the gospel and the finality of Islam. I am a woman who sits on the floor sometimes and talks to Jesus the way you talk to someone who has known you your whole life and loves you anyway. Someone who was there in my grandmother's apartment when I was 8 years old, in a dream, and said my name before I had done a single thing to earn it. I lost my father's approval. I lost my family's embrace. I lost the professional network I had spent a decade building. I lost the identity I had constructed so carefully. The perfect Muslim woman, the defender of the faith, the girl who held the rope. Here is what I found. I found that the rope I had been holding was not attached to anything on the other end. I found that the piece I had been performing had a real version that felt nothing like the performance. I found that the God I had been arguing about my whole life had been trying to get my attention the entire time. And it only took a dream, and a crack, and a kitchen floor for me to stop talking long enough to hear him. To every Muslim woman reading this who has the crack, you know what I mean. The prayers that feel like they go nowhere, the performance of perfect faith, with nothing warm underneath it. The question you are afraid to ask because asking it feels like betrayal. Ask it anyway. He is not threatened by your doubt. He is not offended by your investigation. He waited while I argued against him in academic conferences. He waited while I built my career dismantling his story in front of princes and scholars. He waited while I cracked and fought and investigated and called old friends at midnight. He waited while I sat on my kitchen floor with my phone in my hand, trying to find the words. He waited, and when I finally said I believe, he was already there. He had always been there. He was in my grandmother's apartment when I was 8 years old before I had questioned a single thing. He said my name in that dream before I had done anything to earn being known. He knows your name the same way he knew mine. My father does not speak to me. My family is still silent. The career I built over a decade is gone. The girl who held the rope is gone. And I have more than I have ever had. That is the miracle. That is the only thing worth saying. Write the word rest in the comments. Let me see where this reaches today. May Jesus walk with you today and in every day that is still ahead of you. Amen.